Hello students, an introduction to statistics at Solid Community College. This video will give you a brief overview of what you will need to do for the fourth part of the tuberculosis data project. Before I go into the directions for this, be sure to remember to not include the directions in your submission of the project. You should be rewording what you are doing and making sure it is clear to the reader what you are doing at any given section of the project. This section, or this part of the project, will have 4 sections. The first one, you are going to be creating a contingency table for the success rate data you collected in part 1 of the project. You are going to use member of WHO as the row variable and treatment success as the column variable. You are going to use 100 as assumed new and relapsed cases for each of your members of WHO. So, in order to make something like this, we can go over to Word, or you can do the same in Google Docs. The same directions will apply. You can go to Insert, Table, and we need to keep in mind that in this table that we are creating, we have, if we include member of WHO as one column, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. Then we can adjust it as necessary. So we're going to go to Table and make sure that we make a table that is 5 columns wide. And we're going to need quite a few rows, probably more than they show, so we'll just use 5 by 8 for now, and we'll make more rows as necessary. If we want to match the picture that we want to make here, that means the first column is going to be member of WHO. If I can move this around a bit. There we go. So the first column should be member of WHO. Second column should be the names of the countries. Third column should be successes, fourth column failures, and the last column is totals. If I start at the top, I see treatment success and failure as its own combined row. And I see that as a combination of the third and the fourth. So I'm going to go to the third and the fourth. I'm going to highlight these 2 boxes, right-click, and merge these cells. Then I can input treatment, success, failure. And below that should be my names for success, failure, and total, if I want to try to match what I have up here. You then see that there would be some blank boxes. We can actually take care of those too. I can highlight these boxes, which apparently according to the table from the page should be blank, and I can determine what borders these selected boxes have. I would suggest simply go to borders and make it have no borders at all. But if I want to make it so that it has still a bottom border here and a border on the right so it doesn't look like there's blank spaces, I can go to borders and then make sure it only has right border and the bottom border. So I can select what borders it has. That kind of step is optional, more for visual if you would prefer to have something like that. I think it looks nicer, but to each their own. Then for all the totals, we're going to have 100. So let's just put in 100 for a bunch of these. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that means we need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I need 4 more rows of 100, and those should add up to a total of 1,000 at the bottom. Then I should start to put in my countries. For example, if they have Cambodia and I have Cambodia as well, then I'll put in Cambodia. And I'll indicate the successes as whatever the percentage of successful treatment that I gathered for that country in part 1 of the project. For example, Cambodia had a 94% success rate in 2018 when this original data was gathered. So that means they'd have 94 successes, and 100 minus 94 is going to give me 6 failures, this adding up to 100. You will then include the rest of your countries. So maybe Afghanistan, maybe, let's say, South Africa. Let's also say Belgium. what other countries you have. And again, I'm going to make up success values. So if Afghanistan has a success rate of 72, then 100 minus 72 will give me 28 failures. If South Africa has a success rate of 90, then 100 minus 90 is 10 failures. And for Belgium, if Belgium has a 22 success rate, that means 100 minus 22 will give me 78 failures. You can put in all those values for each country and their success values. Just don't include percentage. You don't need to say 94% because we already are putting it out of 100. And we can put in all 10 countries. So I have 4 here, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then put the total down here of whatever the successes add up to and whatever the failures add up to. All the successes and the failures together should add up to 1,000. Lastly, we want to see if we can make that member of WHO on the far left side for this column here. So let's see if we can do that. To do so, it looks like this is one merged cell, so I'm going to combine all of these together. Right-click and merge these cells. And I could type in member of WHO. If I want to make it vertical, you can do that. You can simply do this by right-click, go to text direction, and decide to have the text vertical to match what we have on the project information page. At that point, once you have your table in, you can resize or move things around. So I can move how wide each of these bars are, something like this. Success and failures probably don't need to be too wide. Oh. Move this over here, try to condense it down. Something like this. You can also fix up these boxes that should be blank, get rid of some of their borders if you like by removing their the borders that you don't want. So I can remove on this bottom one, the bottom border, and the border on the left. At the top, I can remove the right border and the border on the top. Lastly, if you really want to, you can also center everything by simply highlighting the entire table, going to Home, and in the paragraph section, which if you have this full screened, may look like this, simply select Center. It makes it look very nice. All right, so a lot of that is editing stuff, but maybe you learned some things about how to work with tables with that. So, all right, so that's what you're going to be doing for the section A, is creating that table and making sure everything matches up nicely. Then for part B, you are going to be using this table and calculating a few probabilities. Specifically, you're going to be working with the 5th, the 6th, and the 8th member in various questions here. There is a note that says that if either of these countries have either 0 successes or 0 failures, replace all instances of the following questions with a different member. For example, if the 5th country here was, let's say it was, I don't know, Russia. And Russia happened to have 100 successes and 0 failures. And that is my 5th country, my 5th member of WHO. In that case, I'm going to replace any questions that involve that 5th member and maybe say, let's do the 3rd member instead. We do this so that we don't have probabilities that can sometimes calculate out to be 0. We want them to be at least a little interesting. So if Russia had 100 successes and 0 failures, I don't know if it does or not, but if it does, then I would replace any questions that ask to use the 5th member with maybe the 3rd member, or whatever one you choose. If you have more questions about this, I'd ask your instructor about which countries they would recommend working with for these probabilities. With these probabilities as well, since you are going to be showing your work to compute how to calculate these as per the instructions, you can actually do that by also going to the Insert tab. And if you have this full screened, or if not, on the far right side, you may see an option that says Symbols or Equation. If you don't see Equation, you can usually get to that by clicking on the Symbol drop-down menu. This is also available in Google Docs if you're working in there. If you insert an equation prompt, we have now a blank space that says type equation. This will allow us to very cleanly represent how we're doing math, particularly with fractions, which is likely what you'll be doing for these probabilities. For example, if I'm trying to do a particular probability and it comes out to be something like 100 out of 1,000. When I type that in, this is how it normally would look in text, but once I hit space to go to the next one, it reformats and makes it look a lot nicer. So you can have 100 out of 1,000 plus 33 out of 1,000, space, and it reformats, minus 10 out of 1,000, space, equals, in this case, that'd be 123 out of 1,000, or 0.123. This is very nice to show how the probability can look, particularly when you're showing your work. So I recommend doing this for each of these. Lastly, for C and D, you are going to make a confidence interval and a hypothesis test. For both of these, they do say that you may assume that all conditions are met, so we don't need to check those. For the 95% confidence interval, you're going to look at the difference between proportions of successful treatment for the fifth and the sixth member. You're also going to do the fifth and sixth member for the hypothesis test in D. However, unlike for Part B, which said to replace that if either of them had 0 successes or 0 failures, don't worry about doing that for C and D. Just keep the countries you have. If one of them has 0 successes or 0 failures, that's fine. In order to make a confidence interval, you can go to GeoGebra. And since we are doing a confidence interval for 2 proportions, we go to the Estimate section and go to Difference of Proportions. Z-estimate difference of proportions. And I should be able to put in my successes and sample size. For example, if one country had 55 successes out of 100 for that country, and the other country had, let's say, 70 successes out of 100, I can calculate my lower and upper limit for that confidence interval and make an interpretation. Be sure, yet again, to include a snippet of this picture in your document. Lastly, for D, as I said, you're going to create a hypothesis test and make sure that you do all the steps of it. So clearly state the 2 hypothesis tests for if there is a difference in the proportions of successful treatment for the 2 members of WHO. Show your work by including the technology inputs, identify the test statistic, the p-value, your selected value of alpha, and make a conclusion. If you're doing a hypothesis test in GeoGebra, we will go to the test section, and for a difference of proportions, we will select z-test difference of proportions and use those 2 same countries. Just make sure everything here is adjusted and your alternative hypothesis agrees with what should be true. Lastly, one other note just to help out to make these look nice. If you are making hypotheses in here, and these hypotheses likely will have subscripts to represent the 2 countries, you can also do this with equations, again by going to Insert, over to the far right, Equation, and you can start typing in a hypothesis. For example, the null hypothesis would be H subscript, so I do an underline there, or an underscore, 0, and if I hit space, that will adjust it to be a subscript, or if you don't like to do that, there's also an option up here for script when you are in the equation options, and you can decide to have a subscript. So this would be H with a subscript of 0. then my hypotheses should both be values of proportions, so P, and the null hypothesis is probably P equals P, but each of these should have subscripts for those two countries. So maybe I have, in this case, Russia, so P sub Russia, and P sub Italy. This makes the hypotheses also look a lot nicer than trying to type it in as H0 P sub Russia, or as I sometimes see, P Russia equals P Italy. It doesn't really look too nice like this. This makes the formatting look so much better. So hopefully that helps. A lot of this was formatting the table and how to work with equations in Word, but that should be everything you need to know for the fourth part of the data project.